As I said, my name is Greta Allen. I'm the Policy Director with the Colorado Blueprint to End Hunger. I will be leading us through this today, but I'm also going to have some help from Adeline Hodge with Meridian Affairs. Adeline is one of our contract lobbyists, and she will answer all the questions that I cannot. So my goal for today is really just increasing folks' knowledge and confidence in engaging in policy at the state level in Colorado. Whether that policy is anti-hunger or not, it is a blueprint's value that folks have the knowledge and ability and confidence to enter these spaces and feel like you can influence change in ways that are important to you. So we're going to pull back the curtains a little bit. We could probably spend weeks going into the state legislative process. So for some of you, this may feel more baseline if you have a little bit more knowledge. But I just want to make sure that everyone who's participating in our state policy committees, or if you're just visiting us, just gets this base knowledge. So let's jump in. I do want to share, would love to take questions throughout this so it doesn't just feel like me lecturing. So I will pause after every slide to take questions and we can dive in, and I'll try to keep us moving along as we only have 50 minutes today to go through this. All right. So goals and outcomes. I hope everyone leaves with a basic understanding of Colorado state legislative processes and key terms. My goal is to demonstrate how the blueprint, our network, and external partners can participate in the legislative process, and then also share additional resources for folks who would like to dig deeper and learn more. And if we identify today that there are topics that we want to expand on collectively, we can explore what that might look like in another session like this or at a different time outside of the State Policy Committee. So if there's something that we all feel, hey, Greta, we need more time, we can do that. What you can expect is we'll first go over helpful terms and definitions. I'm starting with terms and definitions because I at least want to make sure everyone is familiar with the vocabulary that I'll be using through the rest of this. And please know I'll bring context to all these terms. So if something's a little fuzzy as we define it, it will be later on, and I promise it'll get meaning. Additionally, we'll go over just the Colorado legislature in general, how a bill becomes a law, what's the state budget, and then what does advocacy at the state capitol look like? Kicking us off with definitions. So starting with our first definition, legislators, aka lawmakers, those are the folks that we as Coloradans elected to represent us at the Capitol. These legislators create laws through bills. And so a bill is a piece of legislation that goes through the legislative process. Every bill will have a title in addition to a number. That number has either an HB for House bill or SB for a Senate bill, and then a number that helps it live within that state legislature year. The title has to be strict. It has to be exactly what the bill is about. The reason I mentioned this is that you might be familiar with bills maybe at United States Congress. They tend to be maybe a little bit more fun. They can be more vague, broad, but here in Colorado, the bill title needs to be really strict. The last definition on this page is bill sponsor, and that is the legislator or legislators introducing and leading the bill through the process. These, and I want to also differentiate, there can be multiple types of sponsors. The definition here is referring to prime sponsors, and prime sponsors carry the bill. Their names are associated with it from introduction. It's also their role to introduce the bill. They answer questions, they'll testify on it, and they're also the main contacts for anyone outside of the legislature wanting to engage. But in addition to a prime sponsor, there can be co-sponsors on a bill. So those are legislators that add their names to the bill after it's introduced. That by adding their name, they're sharing their support through committee hearings and also floor votes as well. Any questions about these definitions before I keep us scooting? Great, okay. So keeping on our theme of bills and legislators, you might hear the word pre-file. Pre-file is related to how legislators get 5 sponsored bills to start session. And one is a pre-file, which means it's guaranteed introduction on day 1. So if you're chatting with a legislator, you're interested in what their priorities are, you can likely gather that from their pre-file, or they'll say it's one of my top 3, meaning that they're wanting to introduce it as soon as possible. And so prime sponsors only get 5 bills each session, but there are no limits to how many bills a legislator can co-sponsor, again, just adding their name to a bill. And with all sponsor types, when it comes to bills, the more bipartisan representation of Democrats and Republicans, likely the stronger a bill and the easier time it will have getting through session. A late bill is a bill introduced late. It doesn't just happen. There has to be permission from leadership, from the chamber that legislator is in, and I'll define chamber shortly. Also related to bills, you may hear the word amendment, which is a change that's introduced to a bill in committee or on the floor. And so a bill generally is introduced, and then any changes folks want to make or add-ons, whether it be the legislators who introduce it themselves or after conversations and more stakeholdering, changes can be made through amendments. And lastly, the long bill is the annual state budget that is created by the Joint Budget Committee. Its title, long bill, is because it's a long bill. There's a lot in it, and we'll talk about the budget later on. So Joint Budget Committee, you might hear JBC dropped very often, is a committee of 6 legislators, 3 from each chamber, a chamber being the House and the Senate. And whichever is the majority party, in our case in Colorado, it's the Democrats. That means they get the majority of seats on the Joint Budget Committee. And the Joint Budget Committee, or the JBC, is who writes the long bill, the state budget, every year. Related to money and cost, a fiscal note is the cost of a bill. So when you're going through and you're reading the text of a bill, there will be a fiscal note at the end, and that tells you the cost of it, where that money is likely coming from, and anything else related to that. The last definition on this slide, appropriations, it's a bit nuanced. I decided to define it this way. I'm happy to try it another way if it doesn't land. But generally in this space, you'll hear appropriations as it refers to the appropriation committee, like, oh, the bill is going to appropriations. However, an appropriation itself is the money that's allocated to a bill. So you'll hear this interchanged, but for me, this is how I had it stick in my head. Any questions on these terms? All right. A couple other ones. Chamber, I've said this a couple times already, but a chamber refers to the 2 different elected bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So if you hear their chamber, chamber floor, it's referring to either the House or the Senate. The floor is literally the big room where each chamber considers bills. It's where they're meeting as a chamber all together. And so you'll hear, oh, they're on the floor or they're leaving the floor, and that's what that is referring to. Upon adjournment is when legislators leave the floor for the day to go to their committees. So if you're ever following a committee hearing schedule, you want to know when a bill is being heard, it may say just upon adjournment, which you can kind of get an estimate of when that will happen, but it helps if you have a lobbyist like Adeline hanging out there all day to tell us, okay, we think we're leaving, they're going to adjourn soon. Lastly, the word I have on here is caucus, which in short is just a conference of members who belong to a particular party or faction. We can spend more time on that at another time, but wanted to make sure I defined that here. I also cannot see the chat, so if there's any like burning questions, I'll tap Joelle to tell me if something needs to be said. Great, thank you. Couple last definitions before we dive in. For a committee, have said this a couple times, each bill is reviewed by at least 2 committees, 1 in each chamber, so a House committee and a Senate committee, that relate to the topic of the bill. I have a couple slides later on that show the different committees, and we can kind of guess and talk about where we think a lot of bills related to our work as anti-hunger advocates end up falling. And then conference committee is where assigned members from each legislative chamber meet to work out language that's acceptable to both chambers on a measure or a bill. So as a bill moves its way through the process, which I will show, if there is disagreement between both chambers in their versions of the bill, it may need to go to conference committee to work out language that is amenable to both if something is rejected by the original chamber. Almost done, y'all. TABOR, we could not do this presentation without mentioning it. TABOR is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is fairly unique to us in Colorado. Essentially, in a very, very brief nutshell, TABOR basically means that any revenue increases by tax for our state have to go to state ballot. So if you want to have a bill that starts a brand new program and you want that money to be funded through tax, likely you're going to see that go to ballot. And that when that bill goes to a ballot, that's called a referred measure. So any bill that results in any kind of changes related to the Constitution, which includes revenue and taxes, you're going to see that as a referred measure. Great example is Healthy School Meals for All. It was a bill and it passed, but in order to have it implemented into the state, the voters had to agree that, yep, we agree that the state can take in more revenue to fund this program. So that might be the best example for folks of recent times. All right, done with definitions, let's jump into the legislature. So we have 100 total members in our state legislature in Colorado. There is 65 in the House and 35 in the Senate. Everyone on this call has one of each. And so there is a link in this presentation to find yours. Currently, Democrats do have a majority in both the Senate and the House, and we have a Democratic governor, Jared Polis. Each chamber has leadership for their party, and leadership will often set the tone, in charge of keeping folks in line, and they also control the committee assignments too. So the legislative session is constitutionally 120 days from January to May. Session for 2024 begins Wednesday, January 10th. I did not count out 120 days from that, but you can expect it to end in May. So I did add those special sessions can happen, which is when the legislature is called to meet outside of a regular session on specific topics. Hopefully y'all have recovered, but in November we had a special session. The legislature was called primarily for property tax relief, and that is also when summer EBT was passed as well. So that's our most recent example of a special session. State elections are on even years, the first Tuesday after the first Monday. So as long as there's been a first Monday, that next Tuesday will be an election. Every member of the House has an election every 2 years. So House turnover every 2 years, folks are getting either reelected or new folks are coming in. Senate terms are 4 years. So generally you can expect half of the Senate to turn over or get reelected every 2 years. Any questions on legislature? Okay. I mentioned that we would chat committees. So here is a list of House committees of reference. These committees only meet during session. And so you can see the various ones here. Any guesses on where some anti-hunger related bills might land in a House committee? I can also tell y'all. All right. Generally, we could see them go to agricultural, water, and natural resources, public behavioral health and human services, maybe education, maybe finance. I don't know, Adeline, any others you think we've seen?
If they have any money attached to them, they have to go to appropriations, whether it is their initial committee, which we call the committee of reference, or after their committee of reference. And I'll also say that as a general rule, bills are supposed to go to the committee that oversees the topic most related, but like everything else in the Capitol, there is a dose of politics that happens there. And so, we also strategically talk about where it makes the most sense for a bill to go based on who is sitting on that committee to take a vote. And so, both of those factors are considered kind of the best place for it in terms of topic and in terms of folks who are voting. And then, of course, at the end of session also, when things get really crazy, it's a matter of capacity. And so sometimes bills wind up in a kind of odd committee because that's the committee that has enough time to hear it.
Yeah. And thank you. Next slide, I just have the Senate committees of reference, fairly similar. Names are a little different. So again, maybe agricultural and natural resources is where we end up. Health and Human Services. Senate also has appropriations, education, and local government, and maybe and housing. So I also want to mention I have some slides on testimony, but when we talk about testimony, giving testimony at the legislature, these committees is where that happens. So I'll share a little bit more about that later. Also on the topic of committees, we do have Joint Budget Committee, which as a reminder, they're responsible for the state budget and they meet year round. So unlike the committees of reference, these guys are meeting year round. They're meeting now, going over the current budget request. And so in a nutshell, the JBC is a very powerful committee for legislators to be on. And I'll go into more of that too as we go into the budget. There are other year-round and interim committees. I did not list those out, but there is a link if you want to dig in and see who else is meeting year-round or in the interim. I'm going to dive into how bills become laws, but before, I just want to make sure, are there any needs for clarifications about the legislature or any of the definitions that I went over?
Greta, Bob mentioned in the chat. Sometimes they send bills to a kill committee, like the Veterans and Military Affairs, where the speaker doesn't want them to go any further, and they know that they'll just sort of stay there without any movement whatsoever, and that will be the end of that bill.
Yeah. Adeline, would you like to add any nuance to kill committee? Bob did a great job defining it, but.
Yeah, in Colorado, unlike federally in a lot of states, every bill that gets introduced has to have at least one hearing. We have a gavel rule, and so Colorado is a bit more transparent in that sense than a lot of states. So there has to be an opportunity for public comment on a bill in at least its first committee. The kill committee, traditionally state affairs has been considered a kill committee because there's such a large Democratic trifecta. That's not as necessary. When there are split chambers, often if a bill is coming over, and by split chambers, I mean Democrats control one chamber, Republicans control the other. In that case, the kill committee is often used much more often, and it's more clear because a bill will come over from one chamber and the party in the second chamber has very different priorities and just will automatically send it to that state affairs kill committee. But because there's such a massive majority right now in both chambers, state affairs has become less of a kill committee, I would say, in recent years, and is more a committee for actual bills related to state, veteran, and military affairs.
Emily, thank you. And thank you, Bob, for adding that too. That is one of the nuances that we could add and spend more time on, for sure. So diving into really like the meat of this presentation is how the heck do bills become laws? Like who's in charge of that? When do we find out about it? And all of those types of things. So this is very much my brain on a slideshow. So if it helps to go over it differently or present it in a different way, I would love to hear that because we all take things in differently. So ideas for bills. Before anything becomes a bill, there needs to be an idea. Those ideas can come from an organization, constituents, individuals that are talking to their legislators. It can come from legislators themselves, perhaps related to a personal experience or a passion project of theirs, for lack of a better word. It can also come from previous legislation. Maybe a bill needs to be run for some cleanup for a program. We've got to change some things that this program does. The only way to do it is through lawmaking, or it can be a combination of all of these things. And then for that idea to become a bill, it needs a sponsor, a prime sponsor. Preferably, you have sponsors that are bipartisan and from both chambers. And then lastly, the bill itself has to be written. I think sometimes in this space, there's this stress of like, well, yeah, I know I like this concept, but I can't write a bill. I can't do that language. That's not, as advocates, our job to make it the like bill language that you see when you're reading a finalized bill text. Our job is to be the subject matter experts. Can we provide really clear talking points? Can we say, hey, here's an example bill that really what we think would set us up well in this situation? Can we draw from that as an example? What is evidence of need? And maybe some sample language, but it does not have to be the legalese speak that we see in bills. There are professional bill drafters that get that done. So moving through the processes of the legislature, a lot of the definitions we went over, this is the process for a bill. Very brief. There will be a lot of asterisks on this if I try to flow chart it for every bill situation. So please know there's always nuances and always exceptions, but basically you can rely on this to give you a pretty solid baseline understanding. So a bill will be introduced in its first chamber, and that is the House or Senate. Once it's introduced, it is then assigned to a committee of reference. And that's where those lists of committees, the names, to Adeline's discussion, hopefully we want it to go to the committee that is where the subject matter expertise is. There could be exceptions, but that is where we would like the bill to go. Once the bill gets through committee, if it has a fiscal note or a cost associated, it will also go to appropriations. If there is no cost, it goes back to that first chamber floor for passage. After that first set within that first chamber, let's say we did the House, it starts all over again in the Senate. So it's introduced, it goes to a committee, maybe it goes to appropriations, and then the process ends in that second chamber, hopefully with a vote. So of course, this is an example if a bill passes, we get it all through, it's through both chambers, then it would go to the governor for signature. The governor can also veto, or maybe doesn't want to sign it because it's not politically aligned, but not going to veto it. It could pass without a signature. I do have rulemaking on here, and it's in a lighter color. Not all bills will cause rulemaking, but it is important to include in this from an advocate's perspective of seeing a bill not only through the legislature for passage, but also through implementation and making sure that whatever programs or outcomes related to that bill occurring are still honoring the original intention and what folks were hoping for from it. So a bill will go to rulemaking if it's related to new programs, changes to existing programs, and it goes to a rulemaking hearing of the State Department that is in charge of that implementation. And so a rulemaking hearing is also an opportunity for testimony, public comment. I'll go over that in our testimony parts of this, but it is a way for advocates to interact with this process. After it goes through rulemaking, then it's published in the Colorado Code of Regulations, and the law itself goes into effect. So also not on here, I didn't put ballot measures on here. That could be a potential little side branch of the process of how a bill becomes a law. But in a nutshell, this would be the process. Yeah, Joel.
Maybe a question for Adeline. Lenora asked, how often has Governor Polis vetoed bills?
I don't have the exact number in my head, but he has vetoed more frequently than some past governors. I think this year he got up close to 10, which is a little bit unusual for a Democratic governor with a Democratic majority in both chambers, as you can imagine. But he has also been really clear on some lines in the sand that he is not, for insurance mandates, for instance, are something that the legislature has pushed, health insurance mandates, and Governor Polis's office has said, we're going to veto any bill in the medical space that is going to increase the cost of healthcare. And he's put out signing statements as well with some bills to put kind of put the legislature on notice that, okay, I'm going to sign this bill, or I'm going to veto this bill, and have either like a working group convened by executive order, or say, I'm going to do this, but in the future, I'm not going to sign bills like this, essentially. So he has been more liberal with his veto pen. Do you want me to take this other question as well in here, Joelle? Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a question, how do you determine which chamber the bill goes to first? Is that related to who's the sponsor? The answer is yes, it is certainly related to who's the sponsor. And also, there can be a political calculation here. If a bill is going to be more difficult to get through one chamber than the other, for example, in the past several years, the Senate is considered the more difficult chamber to get a bill through, particularly more progressive bills, because the margin of Democrats to Republicans is much narrower. The Senate tends to be more moderate than the House right now. And so sometimes, depending on the bill, you'll start it in the House, even if you know it's going to die in the Senate, because you want to give it an opportunity to have the conversation. It depends on what your goal is with the bill. Is the goal to really like pass this one thing, or is it to start a conversation, open up the dialogue? Sometimes you'll start a harder bill in the Senate, knowing that you're going to put in all the groundwork, get it through the Senate side, and then have smoother sailing in the House. And if you don't really want to waste a ton of time fighting the bill, counting the votes, all of that in the House, knowing that it's going to die in the Senate. And so the short answer, like many things in the legislature, is it depends. And sometimes it's just a matter of which of your sponsors have bill titles available. So you might have your Senate and House sponsors lined up on a bill, and one of them already has their 5, and the other is willing to make this one of their 5. The prime sponsors in the second chamber, it doesn't count against their 5. And so if your House sponsor has an open title, you might be starting in the House.
Oh, thanks. Any other questions on how a bill becomes law? Great. All right. So, taking a little break from that process to chat state budget, or the long bill. So, the state fiscal year begins July 1st. We are currently operating on the budget that was passed last legislative session. I share this just because it will help with the budget concept. So if you think about it right now, the Joint Budget Committee is working on the budget that will go into effect July 1st of 2024. They've already done the budget for January through June. They did that last session. So the governor and our state agencies submit budget requests by November 1st of each year. So November of this year, 2023, all budget requests were submitted to the Joint Budget Committee by our state agencies. And the JBC is now working on them. They're holding hearings, and they're currently working on writing the budget for that long bill to be introduced hopefully in March. Adeline, I don't know if that's generally the time we'll see that. So once the long bill is introduced, and it alternates the chamber of introduction each year, because rather than it just be there's only one sponsor, or there's one sponsor here and one here, it's the Joint Budget Committee is presenting it. So it would be this year, I actually don't know what year chamber we're in. I'll go to Adeline for that in a bit, but it alternates its chambers, and it undergoes a fairly normal bill process. Again, there will be some exceptions, but as we discussed with one single previous bills, a long bill will go through a somewhat normal process. It's assigned directly to appropriations, and then it's signed. Adeline, do you know what chamber we are this year for the budget?
I believe we're House side this year.
Okay.
Start in the House.
Yep. So the budget, it has to be balanced and it has to adhere to TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. There are 3 sources of revenue that our state has that the budget is considering. So we have revenue from our general fund, which is sale and income tax, for programs, schools, infrastructure, whatever has been said of like, that's what this general fund is being used for. We also have cash funds, which come from fees for government services. So when you pay to register your car, you're paying into that cash fund. And lastly, the federal funding that we receive from Congress. This can be through K through 12 education. Our state departments get federal funding to implement nutrition programs. That is that federal funding. Supplementals are adjustments to the current year's budget, which are considered in that January, February, and March period. Probably a good example for this group is last year when the emergency allotments ended for SNAP pandemic relief and folks were having their benefit amounts for SNAP drop drastically. Governor Polis submitted a supplemental for the Colorado Department of Human Services to provide funding for food pantries and food banks to respond to the increased need and increased strain on our charitable food system. So that was an example of a supplemental on that current year's budget. Yeah. Any questions? Budget, long bill, clarifications?
Greta, we have a question in the chat from Julie
Yeah.
Hall. Do you know what percentage of education funding comes from federal?
I don't. I took Colorado Fiscal Institute's tax ambassador class, and I'm sure they taught me that. It is no longer in my head. Does anyone else know?
We have a representative from CDE, Colorado Department of Education, Colorado School Nutrition Association, or Colorado Fiscal Institute. I believe I saw some of y'all on. If you happen to know the answer, feel free to come on.
I don't necessarily know either, but I don't think it's, my instinct is that it's not very much, is that most of the K through 12 in the state is funded by the state. But I can check with our senior economist who's a little more well-versed in school finance and let you know.
Caroline, thank you. From Colorado Fiscal Institute. Thanks for being here. We'll get you that answer, Julie. Thanks for asking that.
And then Bob in the chat mentioned the public health department is 80 to 90% federally funded.
Yeah, but it
Thanks,
really
Bob.
plays itself out when there are great like cuts in general fund. If you try to cut the general fund on departments like public health, they don't have very much general fund to give up, right? Some others are very heavily general fund, and yeah.
Awesome. Bob, thanks for adding that. It does vary for each state department and what they'll be asking for in their budgets each year. I'll keep scooting us along. So going back to our flow chart of the way a bill moves, I'm going to start adding this to like you personally as an individual, a collective group of advocates. What does it mean to participate in these processes? So what I've done is I've taken the journey that a bill goes on, and instead I've put ideas and ways that we as advocates can be participating at those moments in time, because it's going to look different. It also will look different for each bill. Sometimes this process is super drawn out. A bill sits in appropriations for weeks. There's no action on it. And then all of a sudden it's being heard. Sometimes it moves super quickly. So when a bill is first introduced, the best thing to do is, even prior, if you know it's coming, but reach out to your legislators in that chamber, reach out to your senator, reach out to your representative and say, hey, this is how I feel about this. You're going to see it. And here's what I'd like you to think about. Once that bill gets to committee, I have on here coordinating with the lead organization if it's applicable. When we're working at the state legislature, it's important to be coordinated and strategic in the best ways for us to be pushing our priorities and maximizing our interactions with legislators. So when a bill is in committee, reaching out to the organization that is the lead on that, or organizations plural, they'll have a great idea of what voices do we need to hear? You know, what is that committee's, taste for, do they want a packed room? Would those legislators on that committee be more responsive to very clear, concise, but fewer testimonies? It will vary, and that's where relationships with legislators, having lobbyists available to us at the Blueprint, it really gives us the ability to be strategic of like, what does that look like? If you're not giving testimony, you're not interested in that, there's still the opportunity, if you have a representative or senator that sits on that committee, reach out to them and say, hey, I know you're going to be voting in committee on this. This is why it's important to me, or this is why I hate it. Like, you can have those conversations with legislators. When the bill moves out of committee with a floor vote, it's really the same, reaching out to your legislators, asking for their vote or their not vote. And then still connecting with organizations that are carrying that bill through to be like, hey, what else is needed? Like, we're leaving this chamber, we're leaving the House, we're going to the Senate. Sounds like the Senate's going to be tougher. What should we be doing? And that will be the best way to really build a collective strategy around getting a policy through. When this process is getting repeated in the second chamber, all previous action items apply. But there may be additional messaging regarding amendments that were made in the first committee. Whether we like those amendments, maybe we don't, maybe we want them to be tweaked. That could be a difference experienced when the bill goes through its second chamber. Let's say our bill passes, great, we're done. While it's waiting for signature, sending thank you notes or messages to legislators, bill sponsors, thanking them for supporting is really a strong action to do. And then again, with rulemaking, it won't apply to every bill, but when an item is in rulemaking, you can attend the rulemaking hearing, submit public comment, whether written or stating it verbally at the meeting, to really make sure that the intention of that bill and that it's implemented in the way that folks intended. Any thoughts on this piece? And happy for folks to jump in who have been maybe doing this for a long time. If you feel like there's additional action items I left out from this process, would love to hear from the group. All right.
Greta, for the previous conversation, Becca with Nourish Colorado jumped in to say that per her CFI tax ambassador notes, it looks like there's 0% federal government funding in public schools in Colorado.
There is. It's just not. It's not really like integral to the operations of K through 12. It's like exactly for what someone said in the chat, like special needs things that are like federally protected will have some federal money with them, but the big bulk of our funding comes from the state and income taxes.
Awesome. Thanks, Becca and Caroline. Great. So really focusing on testimony for a bit, because that is where folks as individuals or folks with organizations, it's where we are showing up at the Capitol, whether virtually, in person, to really share our voices and our feelings about these bills. I will say these pictures are from Google. I don't know who owns them, but I liked them and I think they'll help. So providing testimony is the way that you show your perspective, your priorities, your desires for a bill, whether for or against. You can give testimony that is in support of a bill, against it. It can be neutral. It can be, hey, I like this, but you need to add this amendment. Or it can be showing up just to answer questions as a subject matter expert. Testimony can be submitted online in written format. It can be completed virtually via Zoom, or it can be completed in person at the state capitol. The pictures here on the screen, we've got someone looking really excited to give testimony. That's a good example of one of the committee rooms. This one is smaller. It's not a packed house. He still looks really happy to be there. The one on the bottom is a good example if you're at home giving testimony, the screen that you'll see. You can see the very bottom picture is the table where folks in person are giving testimony. The top right-hand corner is the committee room itself. The left is whoever is operating that Zoom, and they will bring you on as a panelist when it's your turn to give testimony. Couple other photos, items. Currently, interpretation in testimony is the responsibility of the organization or individual testifying. I think as a group committed to language justice, we can talk about all the barriers that has. However, it is a reality. If you're ever testifying on behalf of the blueprint or with the blueprint, that is something we will always provide. And if you personally are also experiencing that in your own work, like let us know. Let's see how we can make sure folks are able to get to the Capitol and speak in the language of their heart. Anyone is allowed to sign up to give testimony. It is online through the Colorado Legislature website. And lastly, just sharing, you know, alongside the support and interpretation, the blueprint provides support in preparing testimony, practicing it, determining what format is best for you, and navigating that process. So if that's something, if you're ever engaging on policy that the blueprint is leading, co-leading, supporting, that is something we provide. We want to make sure that you feel confident and safe and really maybe not as excited as that first guy, but excited to give your testimony. The other pictures on this screen just show what it could look like when it's hybrid. The top picture, I believe, is one of our legislators giving testimony. You can see that there's a screen showing those who are virtually participating. And then the bottom is just showing a more larger filled committee room. So depending on the topic of your bill, what the feelings are around it, the committee hearing may be really quiet, easy vote, it gets through, or it could be maybe more of a controversial topic and there's a lot of testimony for and against, and there's a lot of folks wanting to see what's happening. You can listen to testimony audio only through the Colorado Legislature website. This is just showing you how to get there. I also link it in the reference doc. And if you ever need help, I'm happy to help you get there. It can be, for me, it was incredibly educational to listen to committee hearings, even if it was on bills that the blueprint wasn't necessarily tracking. It just gives you an idea for what questions are asked and the ways that committee hearings go. Any questions on testimony? I'd love to hear folks who have given testimony, like any big takeaways for you, things that you would share from that experience. I guess one question hasn't. Oh yeah, Eva.
Buenas tardes. Hace, me parece, 3 o 4 años antes de la pandemia, yo di mi testimonio en la área de educación especial para niños de educación especial, pero específicamente para la área de los niños con dislexia. Pasó la ley, pero es en la área de la educación, para que pase una ley, pues definitivamente los que estaban en el Congreso eran así como, pues en verdad fueron muy groseros, porque a mí me dijo, dime el código postal donde tú vives y te diré la educación que tienen tus hijos. Entonces, pues a veces sí tiene uno que estar preparado mentalmente, que por las leyes son así, entre más las casas den más taxas al Estado, pues la educación y otros servicios son mejores para esas comunidades, y para las comunidades más pobres, pues los servicios son igual más pobres. Entonces, fue difícil, pero pues entiendo, la ley es así. Entonces, pues pasó la ley, ahora ya se manda a identificar a los niños a los 3 años, no cuando ya los jóvenes están demasiado grandes y es difícil reintegrarlos a la comunidad y sobre todo a la escuela.
Eva, thank you for sharing that experience. That is really part of the commitment that we do have, is walking through that experience with folks, and not having folks just feel like you're alone at the legislature testifying. Lenora, would love to go to you, and then after Lenora, I'll scoot us going to make sure I get through this. Happy to hear from you, friend.
Hi, friend. So I just want to amplify what Ava shared about being prepared for lawmakers to be incredibly rude. especially just knowing that something that is so important to us is not necessarily going to be important to the people on the committee who are hearing the testimony. So I'm going to give an example of don't do what I did. And I'm going to caveat this with, this was 25 years ago, and I was really fresh from a series of significant brain injuries. And I was asked to come and testify on 3 times, I think. And so I got up there, and one senator was on his phone, one senator was staring at the ceiling, another senator was doing something else. Then I had less of a filter then than I have now, so I called them out on their behavior. Let's just say it didn't go over very well. However, what I can say is that after they got done smacking me around a little bit, they definitely, everyone paid attention, not only to me and everyone that testified after that, but again, don't do what I did. Pay attention to the coaching that you get from Greta and everybody else on how to do it well. But just go in, if you testify, go in knowing that what we care so passionately about, they might not give 2 flying figs. And so just be prepared for that. That's it.
Lenore, thank you for sharing that personal experience. It is true. I've given testimony, and not all eyes are on you when you're giving testimony. Sometimes it can mean because your bill's easy, they already know how they're voting. Sometimes it can be because they don't care. And that goes back to the need to be strategic and work with, if there are any lead organizations, on what makes sense in terms of testimony and what is really honoring everyone's time of who's involved and who's advocating for this. So thanks, Lenora.
Thank you.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that you all have a chance to at least meet Adeline a little bit more. Her co-lobbyist for the Blueprint, Amanda's not here today, but the Blueprint to End Hunger does have contract lobbyists, Meridian Affairs, and it's Adeline and Amanda. A lobbyist is a professional advocate who works to influence political decisions on behalf of specific organizations and people. I put a couple requirements for professional lobbyists in general in Colorado, but Adeline, if you're still available, would love to have you pop on and just share a little bit of what your scope looks like when working with the Blueprint.
Sure. Thanks, Greta. And yeah, I know our time is limited, so happy to answer questions, but I think often people aren't familiar with what lobbyists do. There aren't a ton of us out there. The lobby is relatively small in Colorado. I am a social worker by background and came from inpatient psych, residential treatment, public school settings, and was really drawn to the role of lobbying and gov affairs is, an advocate. You're a liaison between the legislature and the organizations you represent, who are the people doing the work and who are the experts. Particularly in a term limited state like Colorado, you've got a lot of turnover of legislators, and you've got people who are voting on 700 bills a year, and they can't be the experts on everything they're voting. And so the lobbyists and the staff in the building often have that institutional knowledge to help legislators guide their decision making and help make sure that, when they have a bill in front of them about something related to food security, that we make sure they have the input from you all as the experts, and that we are helping them understand the true implications of their vote on the ground, whether positive or negative. So, our role is to pass legislation, to kill legislation, to amend legislation, to align with our clients' goals. And obviously the Blueprint is one of those clients. So in the food security space, there are a lot of different things we've weighed in on in recent years, and you all, I think, are pretty familiar with those if you've been attending these meetings. But the input from you all is really critical in guiding what we focus on. Of course, for developing that proactive agenda and in terms of what we're going to push forward and lead on, but then inevitably we also need input on the fly as bills pop up that we did not plan for. Some really, really well-intentioned ones from legislators that don't necessarily have the expertise and may bring a bill that they think is really going to help in this space that we have to help guide them on, because sometimes it's not going to function they think that the way that they think it is. And so we often play that role of navigating, maintaining that relationship with the legislators, helping develop them into champions, while also telling them, like, this is not going to do what you think it is, and you really need to work with us up front. And so us having that presence is also with the goal of familiarizing legislators and leadership and others with who we are, and so that if they want to work in this space or they hear about something in this space, they come to us proactively. It's always easier to fix a bill before it's introduced and on the front end, and explain why maybe a bill doesn't need to exist if it's something that can be done through rulemaking, or is better suited through public education campaign, et cetera. And so that's, in a very small nutshell, what we do, help be those liaisons to the legislature, and be a face down at the Capitol every day to get your all's priorities met.
Adeline, thanks. I will have you, if there's questions for Adeline, put them in the chat. And also just know, Adeline and Amanda do come to our state policy committee meetings, for sure, always the second half of them. And so are a resource that we have as a collective as we try to move policy through the legislature. In my less than 60 seconds, just want to wrap up with, meeting with legislatures. I talked about the importance of reaching out to your legislator at all points of the bill's process. And as a constituent, you're encouraged to meet with them, build those relationships. And in fact, building those relationships outside of session is important. Session is hectic. They've got a lot on their plate. And if you have a relationship bill in which you can just text them, email them, call them up to share your thoughts, it can be so much more impactful when we're actually in session versus trying to get their attention in the chaos of it all. And if you ever want to speak with your legislator on behalf of the blueprint or a policy we're pushing, please let me know, and I can help you with that via Adeline, Amanda. We can get that done for you. Lastly, I'll just share, the blueprint, we're committed to not story banking, taking lived experience to push policy. Truly, it is about wanting to support participation in the processes. And ultimately, if you leave this today with more information and you go push a bill that's entirely different from our platform, I don't care. I really just want folks to feel more confident and ready to participate in this.